If you want more local history, visit my website, bismancafe.com, or check out my 2 books, available for purchase on Amazon. And while you're at it, be sure to like and subscribe. This is the earliest known photograph of Bismarck, taken in 1873, the year after Bismarck was founded as the town of Edwinton. It shows a collection of ramshackle buildings along Main Avenue that were rented quickly and cheaply and easily relocatable. Bismarck was a city destined to be great, with grand ambitions that touted it as the next Omaha or even the next Chicago. It had the components to realize that ambition, located at the crossroads of the 2 major highways of the era, the Missouri River and the Northern Pacific Railroad. It was believed to become a major shipping port for raw goods from the northern frontier to the Mississippi and Great Lakes to the east and south, and the Pacific to the west. At the time, timber and fur were chief goods harvested from the area. Soon, gold and coal were discovered in abundance. Then agriculture took off to become the state's primary economic driver. It is because of its ambitious future that drew some of the best characters to the region, people who would leave a lasting mark upon history for not only Bismarck and North Dakota, but the entire world. As a result, Bismarck's history and influence are grander than a city of its size ought to be. Unfortunately, a nationwide economic depression striking only the year after Bismarck's founding stunted its ambitious growth, preventing it from becoming the mega metropolis it was predicted to become. Northern Pacific Railway, which formed to connect the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean, established the town of Edwinton in May 1872, which became Bismarck the following year. It was selected to be the point where its Northern Transcontinental Railway would span the Missouri River, where steamboat traffic was already prevalent. The town was originally known as simply the Crossing, or the Point, until being named for Edwin Johnson, the chief engineer of Northern Pacific, who championed the road. The original crossing was to be at the mouth of the Heart River. This would have positioned Bismarck directly across from what is now known as Fort Abraham Lincoln, roughly 3.5 miles south from its eventual establishment. At least 3 encampments competed to become recognized as the official town. One, of course, was Edwinton. As the town founded and sanctioned by Northern Pacific, one would assume its official capacity could not be challenged. In actuality, the story is rather complicated. There was much confusion as to which town was official, and whether land rights could be protected. Nevertheless, Edwinton was the last of the tent cities to stake a claim, and initially swallowed by the competing tent cities, also called embryo cities, in an 1872 Sioux City Journal article, Carleton and Burley City, which already housed more than 200 people by the time Edwinton was founded, with businesses to support them. Carleton, named for Charles Carleton Coffin, mostly formed organically along the riverbank of the original planned crossing, directly across from what was then called Fort McKean, by prospectors asserting land claims of about 6 miles of riverfront. One man did have sinister motivations, John Jackman, who was financed by competing railroad tycoon James Hill. Jackman and his gang arrived only hours ahead of Colonel George Sweet, Northern Pacific's agent in charge of selecting a town site. Jackman had planted himself into Sweet's party to gain knowledge of Northern Pacific's plans. A reported 15 saloons and several homes of, quote, questionable use were located inside Carleton, giving the settlement such ill-famed nicknames as Whiskey Point, Point Pleasant, and Lookout Point. To the east, on or near the present-day site of Bismarck Airport, Dr. Walter Burley, who was contracted to grade the 50-mile line westward to the river, leveraged his knowledge to assert land and form Burley City. While Carleton was first and bigger, Burley City appears to have been better developed. A newspaper article from June 27th of that year referenced such streets as Greeley Avenue and Durfee Square inside the town, and it's even marked on a map from 1872 along the original railroad route. A Sioux City Journal article from September 7, 1872, highlights the townsite confusion in a rather whimsical manner, seemingly based on slightly inaccurate details while confusing the situation further. It describes Edwinton being laid out around a square called Camp Hancock, laid out by a man the article amusingly describes as, quote, styling himself Colonel Smith, assumingly referring to Colonel George Sweet, who was Northern Pacific's agent in charge of selecting a town site. Speaking of Edwinton, its enterprising citizens have been obliged to move 6 or 8 times within as many weeks. The article continues, 3 weeks ago, all had settled down to laugh and grow fat and rich, but the bubble has burst. The article alleges that Sweet sold overvalued lots in Edwinton before realizing it had no steamboat landing. at which point the lot values diminished, quote, lower than ever did Confederate money at the close of the war. The article proclaimed the thriving village of Burley City as the, quote, important point on the upper Missouri, at the expense of Edwinton. One problem with this conclusion is that Burley City didn't have a steamboat landing either, being even more inland than Edwinton. It was Carleton that was located directly along the riverbank. Regardless, it states that Sweet resorted to offering squatters upwards of $1,000 for land 3 miles south in Burley City, who rejected offers under the gaze of, quote, a wide-awake Dr. Burley, surveying the town site bearing his name. Sweet, who had no legal remedy against squatters, retreated to a new site where Edwinton, now Bismarck, was established, and the railroad shifted north. More than 150 years later, we have the city of Bismarck. Easy enough explanation, right? Well, that only scrapes the surface. While Northern Pacific Railway had chosen its town site and adjusted its railroad course accordingly, land claim disputes continued for years. Many questioned if Edwinton could endure against the competition. Then there's the question of Northern Pacific's motivation to relocate the railroad north. Competing land claims certainly could have done that. Then again, it may have been less costly to keep the original route and pay off land claims. After all, grading work had already been completed almost to the river along the original route. Most importantly, bridging the river at the original crossing would have been far less expensive. It's the reason that point was selected to be the crossing in the first place. Could something as simple as a heavy mosquito population have prompted Northern Pacific to establish its town more inland? That's one suggestion. Lowland flooding was quite likely another motivation to relocate the railroad. Flooding in that area remained problematic until the completion of Garrison Dam in the 1950s. In another twist, it's been suggested that Northern Pacific always intended for its route and accompanying town to be where they ended up being, and the alternative was a ruse to thwart squatters in the first place from their actual target. While that may make for a great plot in a story, the fact remains that it was easier and cheaper to span the river at the original crossing. Furthermore, what we now know as Fort Abraham Lincoln was established near the original crossing to protect railroad interests. Confused? So were people back then. No one knew which city would endure. The earliest structures were made to be portable, with the expectation that they may have to relocate. Newspaper accounts during the time seemed just as confused, with varying accounts to the authenticity of the actual town, and even mistakenly interchanging the sprouting cities. Regardless, the prospector's stratagem ultimately backfired, and the town that is now known as Bismarck endured as the sanctioned city. Lots located along the original route, once worth hundreds of dollars, suddenly were worth pennies. The isolated Burley City failed quickly, but Carleton, benefiting from nearby Fort Abraham Lincoln, prospered for some time. One source says that Carleton was wiped out by flooding in 1874, but another source suggests it lasted much longer. Camp Hancock, originally known as Camp Greeley, was the first permanent settlement in what became Bismarck. The site still contains one of the original buildings. Formerly occupied on August 8, 1872, 3 months after the town's founding, it was a supply depot and infantry post to support construction of the railroad. Establishment of the camp was authorized on April 16, 1872, when the St. Paul-based headquarters of the Department of Dakota issued Special Order No. 65. The order appointed a board of directors, including Dr. Benjamin Slaughter, to select a site for the location of a support depot within the, quote, immediate vicinity of the point where the railroad would cross the river. It replaced Camp Green, which was located at the mouth of the Little Heart River, 3 miles south of where Fort McKean would be established. The camp was formerly occupied on August 8, 1872, when officers arrived aboard the Ida Stockdale, downriver from Fort Rice. It was originally called Camp Greeley, named for journalist Horace Greeley, the liberal presidential candidate running against President Grant. General Sheridan opposed naming the camp after Greeley and ordered the name to be changed. By the time General George Winfield Scott Hancock visited on October 7, 1872, the post was renamed Camp Hancock in his honor. Several structures were erected that fall, comprising of log buildings and tents. One of the original log buildings, which has since been covered by clapboard siding and expanded, still remains as the site as the city's oldest surviving building. Despite the confusion over the town site, initial growth was rapid. By spring 1873, some 60 to 70 buildings had been erected, many of them saloons and others of, quote, ill fame. The number of buildings grew to 147 by May. One correspondence telling in a May 21st, 1873 Minneapolis Tribune article states the town boasted a brewery, pop factory, 3 billiard halls, 3 restaurants, 4 hotels, and a handful of other businesses, including a grocer and drugstore. The drugstore was none other than John Dunn's store. The W.B. Shaw store, operating from a 100 by 25-foot tent along the riverfront, was reported to have already sold more than $60,000 worth of merchandise, equivalent to more than $1 million today. The store had also diversified into banking, with many deposits topping $1,000. The town's estimated population has swelled to nearly 1,000 people and was ambitiously projected to reach 5,000 by that winter, according to an 1873 Minneapolis Tribune article. By comparison, that would have been 1/4 the population of Minneapolis at the time. In reality, that population count won't officially be achieved in Bismarck until the 1920 census. As soon as Bismarck got its footing, a nationwide economic depression stunted development, leaving the railroad unfinished for more than a decade. As it boomed without much civil authority, the town that became Bismarck evolved a dire reputation. It was known as the wickedest city in the West. The town was averaging 1 murder per day. Named for its frequent shootings and brawls, Murder Gulch was the block along 4th Street, between Main and Broadway Avenues, where corruptible businesses were clustered. It was also sometimes referred to as Bloody Fourth and Wicked Fourth. There aren't any specific references to those names in the frontier newspapers, but Linda Slaughter referenced the block's notoriety in her manifesto, stating that, quote, no respectable woman would ever walk down that street. Its fearsome reputation lasted until about 1876. It is rumored that Wild Bill Hancock himself departed the town because he perceived it as too dangerous. In hindsight, this is ironic considering his lethal fate in Deadwood. The 7th Cavalry, under command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, marched from Yankton to occupy Fort Abraham Lincoln in May 1873. The cavalry supplemented infantry personnel stationed there to assist in guaranteeing railroad expansion. Custer remained there until his infamous massacre 3 years later. Edwinton was renamed Bismarck in May 1873, with its name change officially recognized on July 17th. On reporting the news on May 8, 1873, the St. Cloud Journal exclaimed, "We fail to see the improvement." Named after Germany's Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, the name change was an attempt to attract German settlers and investors. The rail line finally reached Bismarck on June 4, 1873, with the first train arriving the following day. The line connected Bismarck to such important destinations as Lake Superior and Minneapolis-St. Paul. Fare is 5 cents per rail mile, or $29.75 from Bismarck to Minneapolis-St. Paul. Burleigh County was organized on July 9th. James Emmons, William Mercer, and John Dunn, all of whom later have North Dakota counties named for them, were its first county commissioners. Among their first acts was naming Bismarck as county seat, establishing a $25 liquor license, and appointing Linda Slaughter as school superintendent. The Bismarck Tribune printed its first edition on July 6th, with a July 11th dateline. Perhaps the most notable headline from its first edition proclaimed, "Burleigh County Organized." Several other local periodicals would follow, but the original Tribune outlasted them all. 1 month later, in August, J.E. Turner, a Northern Pacific civil engineer, supervised planting of the town, assisted by George Sweet and John Bowen. It was then that Northern Pacific's Land Commission first made lots in Bismarck available to purchase. Sweet and Bowen, who have streets named in their honor, were in charge of selling the lots. The Panic of 1873, an international financial crisis and depression, soured Bismarck's promising future, hastened by the bankruptcy of railroad financier J. Cook and Company on September 18th of that year, and Northern Pacific's own bankruptcy in 1875. Railroad construction halted for the next 6 years. As a result, the line essentially ended at Bismarck for almost a decade. While 555 miles of line had been laid, a gap existed westward, and no bridge yet traversed the mighty Missouri River. When permitted by weather, trains could be ferried across the river, but there was very little reason to do so until the westward line was complete. Financial woes, limited rail traffic, little industry, and uncertain land claims stunted growth and development. Only buildings deemed essential were constructed, by the least expensive means possible. Panic of 1873 may have dampened Bismarck's early growth, but it did not stop it entirely. Arguably, for one very important reason: gold. discovered that year in the Black Hills. Ironically, it was the railroad's sudden end in Bismarck that propelled its sudden boom, as gold prospectors arrived to the railroad's terminus in Bismarck before setting off on their journey to the Black Hills, in a gold rush that lasted until about 1878. Aside from the gold rush, Bismarck still had one important asset: the river. Steamboat freighting was frenetic. Sustained by the railroad's terminus, steamboat cargo was transferred from the river to the railroad for further distribution to the east. Bismarck was incorporated as a city on January 14, 1875. Edmund Hackett was appointed the first mayor until a formal election was held in April, when John McLean was chosen as the first elected mayor. Over the next few years, Bismarck staggered along with little growth. Roughly 5 years after construction abruptly halted, Northern Pacific had enough capital to construct a bridge spanning the Missouri River and finish its north transcontinental line. Thomas Rosser was brought back in to oversee the bridge's completion. In preparation, Northern Pacific established a work camp on the west side of the Missouri River. By December 1878, the work camp site was chosen as the new county seat for Morton County and christened Mandan, named for the Native American tribe who once occupied the land. Several other names were considered, including simply Morton. Prior to Mandan, Morton's county seat was Lincoln Township, a civilian camp located just north of Fort Abraham Lincoln, near where the railroad was originally expected to cross the river. As Mandan grew, Lincoln faded to obscurity. Mandan was formally organized as a town in 1879, which is considered the city's founding year. Relocating the post office into the town sanctioned it as official. Mandan's population was already estimated at about 230 people, nearly all railroad workers, and was rapidly increasing as prospectors sought to benefit from what was expected to become another major railroad hub, some of whom were the same people who sought fortune with the founding of Bismarck a few years earlier. P.J. Callahan's Mandan House was likely the first business within city limits, a 24 by 56-foot motel and restaurant for the rail workers. The first framed building erected in present-day Mandan was a 2-story office for the chief engineer. Lots were first put up for sale and legally transferable in March 1879, by which time 150 lots were already reserved and permits for 40 buildings approved. In April, the official plat was filed and a town site organization established. Edmund Hackett, Bismarck's first appointed mayor, was elected president of the association, a close equivalent to mayor. That same month saw the first baby born in Mandan, to Mr. and Mrs. Milan Harmon. The Mandan Criterion was the city's first official newspaper. It published its first edition on May 24th. By this time, track was laid to about 5 miles west of the Missouri River, almost to the Heart River, and efforts were well underway to recruit around 500 men for grading the westward line and constructing a bridge to span the Missouri. General laborers were paid between $1.25 and $1.50 per day, and bridge contractors starting around $3 a day. In February 1879, General Thomas Rosser employed about 50 men to lay down temporary track across nature's ice bridge, the frozen river, directly connecting Bismarck and Mandan for the first time. Its primary purpose was to transport supplies for the railroad. By the time of its discontinuation, on March 11th, 538 carloads of material had been transported across the frozen river. In April 1880, Northern Pacific studied miles of riverfront to determine the best crossing. One contender was the original planned crossing, across from Fort Abraham Lincoln, where the river narrowed to less than 1,000 feet. However, the ground was weaker here, so it was decided to narrow the river artificially, where stronger footings to support a bridge could be placed. Also, diking the river's western bank cost less than rerouting the railroad south to take nature's advantage of Fort Lincoln's crossing. By June, the bridge's final location was more or less decided, within less than 300 feet of its existing line. This location wouldn't require considerable reconstruction of the line and contained suitable grounding. Its design was decided by the following month. Northern Pacific officially approved the bridge's construction on December 16, 1880. Dike work commenced almost immediately, in fall 1880, completing its foundation. They constructed a wired willow mattress for the dike, which is a technique to counter erosion, in this case made from willows, to revegetate the shore. In January 1881, cottonwood logs were placed onto the mattress to wall in stone and frozen earth for the dike. The severe winter season of 1880 to 1881 resulted in regional flooding. By some accounts, the severest witnessed even to this day, and ice rushed down the river with, quote, unusual violence. The dike remained mostly intact until a river current eroded about 200 feet during the spring and summer. More impactful, the navigable river channel shifted west of the dike, toward the Mandan side. It was unsure which channel would become permanent, so engineers planned for both possibilities, until it gradually shifted back to the east. In May 1881, engineers unsuccessfully attempted to close the west channel with a pile bridge. When the river receded, another attempt commenced in July, and the pile bridge was completed by August. Channel silt completely filled in the west channel by early winter. The bridge deck was built to be 50 feet above the high-level river mark. The impressive height was attributed to the high bluffs to the east to compensate for the unpredictable river levels caused by ice jams. The deck rests on 4 granite piers, which were built for the dual purpose as icebreakers through its steel-covered points placed against the current. In January 1881, Northern Pacific awarded contracts for the bridge itself. Ground was first broken on May 12, with work for the east abutment. Foundation work for the easternmost pier began the following day and was completed on November 20th. The caissons used to construct the piers and the river channel itself were 74 feet by 26 feet by 17 feet, made of pine framing with 3-inch oak plank encased with 82,000 pounds of iron. The working chamber, where laborers would work in the depths of the river to build the piers, was 7 feet high. The caissons were built on shore before getting towed into position to be submerged using 500 cubic yards of concrete placed above the working chamber. Air was pumped into the working chamber to displace water for the workers. The approach spans on each end were completed by May 1882. The first of the longer bridge span was erected between the easternmost piers, with the first iron placed on July 27th, and the span completed on August 12th. The second span was completed by September 9th, and the final span on October 7th. By this point, only the deck floor and some minor finishes were needed before the bridge's dedication that same month. What many may not know is that tunneling the river was also being considered in 1880. There were multiple reasons for considering a tunnel instead of a bridge, chiefly cost and time. It was estimated that an iron bridge of, quote, great height and length, then planned to be nearly 2 miles long, would cost $1.5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's more than $40 million today, as opposed to $600,000 to $750,000 for a tunnel, about half the cost, which could also have been completed quicker. There were also concerns over foundation grounding and common ice jams. The tunnel would have begun its westward descent at the Sheraton House, where today's historic depot now stands, and extend almost 13,000 feet, one of the longest in the world at the time, to a depth of 20 feet below the riverbed. It seems that Northern Pacific was never fully committed to the idea of a tunnel, however, and quickly abandoned the idea in favor of a bridge. The tunnel concept was pitched to Northern Pacific by Mr. H. Clark, a railroad contractor who previously built the impressive Boston Waterworks Tunnel and selfishly sought the Bismarck project. For decades, Mandan was a completely independent city from Bismarck. These twin cities didn't complement each other in the same way they do today. Transportation between them wasn't easy, nor was there strong motivation to do so. You could hop on a quick train ride across the river, but that cost money. The Liberty Memorial Bridge opened in 1922, but most people still didn't own vehicles at that time. As a result, Mandan boasted a strong economy and commerce independent of that of Bismarck. In fact, Mandan had a national department store, J.C. Penney, before Bismarck did by 2 years, opening in 1920. By comparison, Woolworth was Bismarck's first national department store, opening in 1922. Mandan very much served as a railroad hub to the west, and Mandan was more of a railroad town than Bismarck had become. In many ways, Mandan was the chief city west of the river, and Bismarck east to Fargo. struggle. As the bridge's inevitable completion improved access across the river, 1881 would be a momentous year for Mandan. That was the year Mandan was incorporated as a city on February 24th. Both its first bank and drugstore became established that year. Northern Pacific dedicated Mandan's first permanent train depot the following year, in 1882. The beautiful two-story depot served dutifully for decades until being replaced in 1930. In March 1883, the territorial legislature narrowly passed the Capital Commission Bill that demoted Yankton as capital of Dakota Territory and established requirements for selecting a new capital. The primary justification was to centralize the capital as opposed to Yankton's distant location on the southeast corner of the territory. Governor Ordway signed the bill, known as House File Number 217, on March 8th. Becoming capital would instantly rocket Bismarck's worth and ignite a development boom. Despite its seemingly obvious choice as capital from today's perspective, however, Bismarck was not initially favored among the dozen or so prospects, and Yankton would not willingly cede the capital without a fight. The Capital Commission Bill defined the 9-man commission tasked with selecting a new capital, setting a July 1st deadline. It proclaimed that the commissioners be paid $6 per day for their work, and that each enter into bonds totaling $40,000. Two of these commissioners ultimately will become among Bismarck's most noted historical figures. One was Alexander Mackenzie, a Northern Pacific agent and lawman from Bismarck, who later becomes a powerful political boss. Another, the committee chairman, was General Alexander Hughes of Elk Point, who later establishes Hughes Electric with his son in Bismarck and becomes a principal real estate investor here. The commission bill required that the chosen city donate or guarantee $100,000 and 160 acres of land to house a capital for the seat of government. Another requirement was that the site be central and accessible from all points of the territory. Commissioners considered both the current and future boundaries, given that there was contemplation that the territory would eventually be split at the 46th parallel to form two states. Ultimately, it was split at the 49th parallel in 1889. At least 9 cities were under legitimate consideration to be the new capital. Huron, Mitchell, Pierre, Ordway, Frankfort, and Steele were first to submit bids, followed by Bismarck, Aberdeen, Redfield, and a handful of others. With the bulk of the population centered in the southern half of Dakota Territory, it was anticipated that the capital would remain there. In particular, Huron and Redfield were thought to be early frontrunners. Statistically speaking, Bismarck was a logical choice. Its location was roughly 40 miles from the territory's geographic center and would have remained within 50 miles after the foreseeable boundary split. It was also positioned at the crossroad of the Northern Transcontinental Railroad and the Missouri River, the major highways of the era. Furthermore, Northern Pacific Railway, with all its clout, favored Bismarck as capital. In reality, Bismarck was perceived to be on the border of civilization, and some viewed the area west as barren waste. By his own admission in an interview with the St. Paul Dispatch, Chairman Hughes's perception improved after traveling through the region during the vetting process. As an underdog, Bismarck presented a competitive bid that far exceeded the minimum requirements, 320 acres, along with the required monetary stipulation. Half of those acres would be sold and guaranteed by private citizens, totaling $300,000, bringing Bismarck's total offer to $400,000 and 160 acres of land. Northern Pacific, lobbying for Bismarck, would donate the land, while private citizens would contribute the remaining funds. The commissioners visited each city under consideration before convening in Fargo that May to make the final determination. There, in a last-ditch effort, a group of Fargo citizens demanded to persuade Fargo as a contender. After a short hearing, the request was denied. Fargo did not meet the bill's stipulation, requiring that the capital be centrally located. The first ballots were cast on June 1st. Only one commissioner initially voted for Bismarck: Alexander Mackenzie, Burleigh County's sheriff and an agent for Northern Pacific. Interestingly, Mackenzie himself voted against Bismarck in the second ballot round, opting instead for nearby Steele. After 13 votes over 2 days, Bismarck won the majority on June 2nd. Alexander Mackenzie is credited with negotiating to secure enough votes for Bismarck. In the end, Hughes cast the tie-breaking vote after previously supporting Mitchell and Redfield. Despite the agreeable collaboration between Mackenzie and Hughes, the two men later become fierce opponents. Upon approval by the governor, Yankton was immediately stripped of its position. Territorial offices were established in a temporary capital in Bismarck until a permanent structure could be built. Yankton would not surrender the capital easily and challenged the constitutionality of its relocation. Allegedly, only the legislature and governor could assign a new capital, not a commission. District Chief Justice Edwinton, a Yankton local, agreed. He granted a restraining order against the commissioners, declared that its officers were appointed illegally, and removed them from office. The legal matter was appealed to the Territorial Supreme Court, who overruled Judge Edgerton's decision, but not until September 1884, when construction was already nearly complete on the capital in Bismarck. Nevertheless, Bismarck was legally victorious in procuring the capital. The assumption to capital instantly propelled Bismarck's prominence and worth. Land values shot up overnight, and several major construction projects commenced. But its growth was nowhere near the level predicted in a June 8, 1883 news article that foresaw Bismarck reaching 20,000 residents by 1885, a mere 2 years later, which Bismarck wouldn't hit, in actuality, until the 1950s. Along with Bismarck's capital assumption, there was a major push towards statehood that year in 1883. Although statehood was strongly approved by the public, the United States Congress rejected the application due to poor voter turnout. It would not be until 1889 that North Dakota and South Dakota entered statehood, where Bismarck resumed capital of North Dakota. The new territorial capital was occupied at the end of 1884, just in time for the 1885 Legislative Assembly. Architect Buffington of Minneapolis designed the building, and more than 4,000 people were involved in its construction. The capital was erected at the center of the 160 acres Bismarck donated for its construction. 2 stories of it were built during the winter, requiring bricklayers to maintain a sheet iron stove to keep the mortar from freezing. The Capitol was among the first buildings, if not the first, to be lit by electricity in Dakota Territory. It contained more than 4 miles of steam pipe and 5 tons of carpet. Excavation commenced on August 17, 1883, and the cornerstone was laid September 5th. Numerous dignitaries attended, including Sitting Bull and former President Ulysses S. Grant. By January 20th of the following year, 4,000 bricks, made of Juliet stone and terracotta, had been laid, encased in cement, and all iron work was complete. Initially, only the Capitol's central core, referred to as the tower, was finished. The tower was 92 feet by 153 feet, with 3 stories, plus a 12-foot high basement. The east and west wings attached to the tower consisted of empty shells, to be completed when diminished capacity necessitated expansion. Fire consumed the state capitol on December 28, 1930. The fire was determined to have been caused by spontaneous combustion from a collection of rags covered with turpentine and varnish that were used to prepare for the upcoming legislative assembly. Insurance only covered about $728,000 of the resulting damage. The actual loss was in the millions. Most of the important state documents were destroyed in the fire, including all but 1 copy of the state constitution. Even prior to the capital's destruction, the state had already been anticipating the need for a new capital to replace the 1884-built Dakota Territory capital. The overcrowded building was approaching 50 years old. The Liberty Memorial Building was built in 1924 to help alleviate some of the crowding of the expanding state government until funding for a new capital could be secured, which was suddenly stifled by the economic crisis of the Great Depression. The current capital was completed in 1934. Other than the telegraph line, which was set up alongside the railroad as construction progressed, Bismarck's first utility was the waterworks, established in 1886. Bismarck's Waterworks was originally a private venture established by Alexander Mackenzie, famed political boss and businessman. The system was crude and inefficient, pumping unfiltered river water through a system of pipes. It was problematic, frequently clogging with river silt or becoming frozen in the winter. Bismarck's waterworks remained a privately owned system until 1923, shortly after Alexander Mackenzie's passing, when residents passed a bond measure to acquire the water department and fund a filtration plant. The city acquired Bismarck Water Company for $265,000, down from the original asking price of $318,000, offered by company head Judge George Flannery, who was executor of Mackenzie's estate. Construction immediately commenced on the new filtration plant, and bids sought to renovate the water plant. Expanding the electric service in Bismarck contains one of the funniest stories in Bismarck's histories, painting an interesting portrayal of Bismarck's early politics between an ally turned foe. Electricity first arrived in Bismarck in 1883. Although it wouldn't become widely available to private citizens for some years to come. The original capital was the first thing lit by electricity in Bismarck, having been wired for electricity during construction. While Hughes Electric is often credited with pioneering local electric service, it was actually Charlie Thompson and Charles Gilman who were first granted authority, known as franchise rights. It was in his role as general contractor in constructing the original capital that Thompson acquired an 8-light power plant from Vanderpool Electric Light Company in 1883 and wired the capital for electric light to be powered by these generators. For the sake of historic comparison, this was only 4 years after Thomas Edison invented the first viable incandescent light bulb, and the year after, he founded his namesake Edison Electric Illuminating Company. The first public power plant was completed in June of 1887, along with 100 electric poles, and service began June 15th. At first, service was extremely limited. The city government was the first subscriber, implementing 9, quote, arc lights of 1,200 candle power each to artificially light its streets. Burleigh County also installed 2 streetlights at the courthouse and jail. The Sheraton House was the first private building to be lit by electricity in 1888. Hughes Electric is credited with expanding local electric service to the masses. It was founded by Edmund A. Hughes and his father, Alexander Hughes. While Alexander, prominent in his own right, was company president, it was young Edmund who had the strong interest in electrical service and chiefly operated Hughes Electric. Some sources attribute Hughes Electric with being the first in the nation to produce an electric stove, although there are competing claims. Edmund's brother, George, is credited with the invention and did serve as an executive with Hot Point and General Electric, principal appliance manufacturers. By December 31, 1894, Bismarck granted Hughes Electric a 20-year electric franchise. The agreement was vetoed by Mayor Leslie on January 8, 1895, and repealed, allegedly in collusion with Alexander Mackenzie. Former allies, the Hughes men had fallen out of favor with Mackenzie, who endorsed someone else for the franchise. This erupted a long-lasting adversarial relationship between the men. Edmund Hughes, by the way, was superintendent for Mackenzie's waterworks not much before. His father, Alexander Hughes, is credited alongside Mackenzie in securing Bismarck as capital in 1883. The city commission overruled Leslie's veto, but that didn't end the conflict. Like a pack of schoolyard bullies, the Mackenzie gang were unrelenting in their childish pursuit against Hughes. Later that year, the commission voted to expunge any record of the incident. Under the direction of Commissioner Edward Patterson, a Mackenzie ally who would soon become mayor, the commission introduced a new ordinance repealing the original that granted Hughes the franchise. Believing in his legal authority to prevail, Hughes proceeded with erecting electric poles and building a power plant on the northwest corner of Thayer Avenue and 4th Street, on the site now occupied by the Wards Building. The wires were subsequently trimmed and the electric poles cut down, apparently under orders from Patterson and Mackenzie. In response, a lawsuit endured into 1896, when Mackenzie's efforts to undermine Hughes were deemed unconstitutional. Telephone service arrived in 1901. Bismarck Tribune publisher-editor Marshall H. Jewell petitioned for the franchise. By August, poles and lines were being rapidly installed. The new telephone exchange could handle 125 lines. Telephone operators, located inside the First National Bank building, were treated to a modern electric light system alerting them when someone either made a call to the switchboard or hung up the receiver, rather than the traditional bell. It was said to be easier to monitor which lines were in use. In 1956, Bismarck's telephone system converted to the traditional dial system. Much of Bismarck was wiped out by the 1898 fire. The fire was discovered shortly before 9 p.m. on August 8th, when smoke was seen coming from a Northern Pacific freight house. The fire quickly spread uncontrolled. Main Avenue was first to be consumed, but then it spread to Broadway and outlying sections. The heat was so intense that it melted even stronger brick buildings into, quote, heaps of charred brick. First by shattering their windows, then engulfing the interior. Even worse, gunpowder that was stored inside the warehouse and other buildings ignited and caused explosions. According to the Bismarck Daily Tribune article dated August 10th, 1898, an explosion at the warehouse released the flames into adjacent buildings, quote, simultaneous with an explosion in the freight warehouse. An immense section of the roof was lifted high into the air, and the flames, which had been checked for a time, leaped forward with renewed vigor and fury. The telegraph office was among the first destroyed, cutting off chances of outside assistance. Even a desperate distress call to neighboring Mandan was never received. Even so, Mandan quickly became aware of the massive inferno lighting to its east and dispatched firemen to assist. The fire was mostly extinguished by midnight. In just 3 hours, 2 entire square blocks were in ruin, most of Bismarck's commercial district. While the most significant damage was downtown, winds carried flames as far north as the capital. Some residents located at least 6 blocks from downtown were damaged or destroyed. Among the most notable structures damaged or destroyed by the fire included the Northern Pacific Railway Depot, Mellon Bank, Merchants Bank, residences of Alexander Mackenzie and the Webbs, Webb Brothers Dry Goods Store, the U.S. Post Office, U.S. Surveys General's Office, the Bismarck Daily Tribune Building, and the massive First National Bank block, which was the highest estimated loss and Bismarck's largest privately owned building at that time. While fires were common in Bismarck's earliest days, none compared to the devastation of the 1898 fire. In its aftermath, the city implemented stricter fire codes, and most of the buildings constructed moving forward were built of brick and concrete, some of which were even labeled as fireproof. The total loss was estimated at nearly $500,000 in 1898 figures. The fire reduced much of the city to rubble and helped accelerate the city's push from a frontier town into a modernized major city. Let's take a look at some milestone first. The first hospital not only in Bismarck, but all of Dakota Territory, was St. Alexius, founded in 1885 by the Benedictine sisters. The Shaw and Cathcart store was Bismarck's first retail store, and also its first bank. John Yagan set up Bismarck's first restaurant out of a tent. The first traffic signal was installed at the intersection of 9th Street and Main Avenue in 1939. Bismarck's first paved street was Broadway Avenue between 2nd and 4th Streets, paved in 1916. It was paid for by Bismarck's first special assessment. The first air flight over Bismarck happened in 1916. It was made by Chicago aviator Daredevil Mills. The first movie was shown at the Bismarck Athenaeum in 1903. And finally, Linda Slaughter established Bismarck's first school at Camp Hancock in August 1872. Now, let's look at some of Bismarck's most important pioneers. Alexander Mackenzie was an influential political boss for decades, the first elected sheriff for Burleigh County. And, while acting as an agent for Northern Pacific Railway, he influenced moving the capital of Dakota Territory to Bismarck in 1883. Linda Slaughter moved here with her husband, Dr. Benjamin Frank Slaughter, who was post surgeon at Camp Hancock. Linda Slaughter established Bismarck's first school at Camp Hancock in August 1872, and later went on to become Bismarck's first postmistress. She was also a lawyer, journalist, and women's rights activist, and an author. Her published manifesto, Fortress to Farm, offers some of the most specific details into Bismarck's early history. Walter Burleigh, namesake of Burleigh County. He was a Northern Pacific contractor and founded a competing tent city southeast of where Bismarck would become established. General Thomas Rosser was the Northern Pacific engineer in charge of surveying the route and building the bridge across the Missouri River. Dr. Fanny Quain was North Dakota's first female doctor. She became nationally recognized for her work against tuberculosis. The Benedictine sisters founded St. Mary's Academy in St. Mary's Church, and later St. Alexius, the first hospital in Dakota Territory. George Sweet was a lawyer for Puget Sound, Northern Pacific's auxiliary real estate company, chiefly responsible for procuring land and selecting town sites. I hope you enjoyed this look through Bismarck's history, covering its founding through the 1898 fire. Once again, if you want more local history, watch my History Talk segment on KFYR+, or check out my 2 books, available for purchase on Amazon. Visit bismarckbook.com for more information.